So first off, you're going to notice that my breakdown of The Last of Us, my breakdowns, are going to be different than when I break down other shows. Why is that? That's because HBO reached out to press and said, don't you dare use any screen grabs, video, or audio from these episodes. Even after the episode airs, you're not allowed to do it. I said, can I grab it from the HBO Max app and not the screener app? And they were like, don't you dare. Smiley face. I can only use images provided by the press site and from the trailer that was released publicly, the trailers. I know it seems like a crazy policy meant to shut down any real chatter about this show. I think that this kind of online discussion is the lifeblood of the big shows. So when it doesn't happen for a show like Andor, I think it's embarrassing. So for HBO to actively get in the way of that is weird. Some of us on YouTube have been discussing this behind the scenes, and I know that some channels are just going to go for it. And we'll see what kind of enforcement HBO decides to do. I don't want to be in HBO's poop list, as I discussed in a recent live stream, so I'm going to honor their wishes with this first breakdown. And we'll see how it goes, and then maybe we'll be able to change things up for episode 2. But thank you for bearing with me, and this is going to be it's going to be more of a spoiler review and a discussion about the show, and I will be pointing a couple of things out, important things to know as well. But you'll see I've put chapter times in here to help you navigate the discussion. All right, so first off, let's talk episode 1 overall. To be honest with you, it's lower energy than I would have liked from a producing standpoint or an HBO executive standpoint. I'd be like, can you give me a little more? Like the middle of the episode where all hell breaks loose. That was amazing. That was amazing. By the way, you can really feel the absence of Twitter with how slowly and sporadically news spreads here, of this new, pandemic, right? This fungal pandemic. We're going to talk about that too. Especially in the suburbs. It takes so long for Sarah to find out what's going on. She's not really looking into it, though, also to be fair. And that lady at the watch store could have said something. She was like, go home. I'd be like, come on, lady, you can't give her a little bit of a heads up? She's a nice kid. But this takes place in 2003, and I looked it up because I was like, why isn't she on Twitter? And Twitter didn't launch. It seems like we've had Twitter forever, but in fact, Twitter didn't launch until 2006 and didn't really start to have a real user base until 2007. Oh, isn't that interesting? I think I joined in 2010. When did you join Twitter? It's so weird. All right, to me, I think it really would have helped if they'd had Twitter. It would be, it's like the reason they got rid of Spores. They made some decisions that I think benefit them, but, maybe take a little bit away from the show. All right, so to me, the whole sequence, where all hell was breaking loose, felt like a ride. Oh, I loved it. Or a theme park style walkthrough like Universal does, or that Walking Dead has, been famous for doing at Comic-Con. I don't know if they're still doing it at Comic-Con, but I did one and it was really cool. And the level of, the budget they spent on it and how immersive it was awesome. And I felt like that when I was watching the middle of this episode. To me, one of the best creative aspects of episode 1 is that it knows when and how to enter a scene. And this is a very important skill to have as a screenwriter. So I love this part. Here are some examples of how well this is done. When Joel and Tommy drive up to the neighbor's house to rescue Sarah, already up to speed. She doesn't have to say, oh, there's a zombie apocalypse. Oh, she's weird. She's biting people. They're like, we know. Get in the car. That was great. I can't believe that neighbor. It's like, get back and stuff. I guess so. It's crazy. Pay attention to the instructions. All right. When they entered Main Street after the mayhem had already started, like when the police cars were driving by in the distance, 6 cars, that to me was cooler than when the fighter jets were overhead. I was like, that's awesome. Go in the other direction. When they were deciding where to go, I was like, this is a fascinating conversation. And it was very scary because, we've gone through this to some degree with the pandemic, but this is even worse. And then also at the end of the episode, when Joel and Tess are breaking into the Fireflies headquarters, although I didn't even really know what they were doing at first. I don't think it was very well explained. I think in some cases they expect you to come in here having already played the game. The games, this first season is based on the first game. There have been 2. And they can't get the door open. They're like, is there a piano in front of it? I'm like, why do you think there's a piano in Firefly headquarters? And didn't they know they were entering in a hallway? But I loved when the blood was coming under the door, the fresh blood. I was like, this is neat. And it was far more interesting to enter the scene that way rather than to see the actual firefight with the Fireflies. I mean, you've seen shootouts. You've seen one, you've seen them all. And this, to me, I thought was more interesting. It was refreshing. It was a refreshing change of pace. I loved it. If only the episode ending was as strong as these other moments in the middle of the episode. I mean, I guess that Firefly thing was toward the end, but I think panning up in the rainstorm with the lightning, and they were like, look at that destroyed building. How is that giant, building still kind of like standing, even though it was like kind of like dominoes had fallen? But it wasn't that shocking to me, because especially the second half of this episode, it so much looked like The Walking Dead aesthetically that it didn't seem particularly fresh or special. In fact, when they were walking away in the rainstorm, it reminded me very much of the iconic poster for The Walking Dead, the very first poster. And I was like, I've seen that before, actually. I've watched a lot of apocalypse stories. This ain't my first domino building situation. There's also, of course, the radio coming to life with a song that's really a message, but I didn't understand what the message was. I tried to find out what the song was. I really didn't care that much, to be honest with you, because I've watched other episodes so far and it really hasn't come up. And it was just hard to tell what the message was, even though they'd kind of discussed the code already. So I was like, well, he missed, it's like, Joel's not home right now. Leave a message. In episode 2, as you'll see next week, humanity, in effect fighting plants, aka Mother Nature kind of, is played up more. And that gives the show more of its own personality. And I like that more, because then you're like, oh yeah, that's what The Last of Us is, mold. Now let's discuss the mold. If anyone here has ever had mold, I have, it's no joke. I got the heebie-jeebies. I'm a germaphobe because of the mold situation I dealt with, and I really don't like gross stuff growing on people. And so this is tough. This is tough, man. This is a tough show for me. But the very opening scene, as I said in my non-spoiler review, this show reminds me a little bit of Westworld with the opening sequence, but it also reminds me a bit of Watchmen. And I thought that the 1960s talk show that they opened with reminded me very much of Dr. Manhattan's own talk show appearance. I was like, wow, if Dr. Manhattan walked in here right now, it would totally work. And it is interesting to directly contrast how a viral pandemic like COVID ain't nothing compared to a fungal pandemic, because there is no cure. It's hard to believe that there would be no cure for something, but I guess that is the case. The science seems legit. And on that note, zombie ants are real. I looked them up and they are disgusting. That's even down to the stuff growing out of their heads. Oh my God. Talk about tough to look at. And I also think pointing out how LSD is a fungus, boy, wow, yikes. And that fungus can cause you to hallucinate, which LSD does. That's also kind of interesting as to how this would work in humans. And then they throw in global warming, raising the temperature so this can all go down. And it seems like, they make it seem like it really could happen. Although, they kind of messed that up, and we'll talk about the Spores in a moment. But I want to take a side detour and bring up the recent Poison Ivy solo comic. Is anyone reading that? It's only okay. But they upgrade Pam's powers with this title to be very much like the fungus in The Last of Us. In fact, she is like a living carrier of these of this mold, and spores she can control the spores, but she can also fight them off. So that's why she isn't totally transformed. So she has this internal struggle all the time that she's dealing with, so she doesn't become a zombie herself. And because it's a comic, by the way, they have no budgetary restraints, and they can do a heck of a lot more than this show can do with fungus. And I think it's a little bit, I wish that this show had as much stuff going on like the comic, because that at least you'd be like, that's a lot of fungus. Oh man. I think if it had more fungus, that would be the dragons of The Last of Us. But it has very little fungus and very little fungus zombies, which I think is a choice. And we'll see if that was the right choice. But anyway, at first I did not like changing Pamela Isley's, aka Poison Ivy's, powers to be this way. I was like, don't like this change at all. Don't like it, especially because it grosses me out. But after watching this show, I'm like, and seeing the science and seeing it was based on real stuff, I was like, I kind of do like it. And it also makes Poison Ivy quite current. Let's go with it. So check out that comic. As I said, it's not great, but it's actually better than a lot of the other comics I've been reading lately. Comics are in a tough spot right now. But if you're particularly a fan of The Last of Us, you should see what they're doing with Poison Ivy. It's quite interesting. Now let's talk spores. They are a big part of the game, where characters often have to don gas masks so they don't get infected. And it was quite a big deal when the show revealed that they would not be using spores, with the fungus instead spreading through tendrils. So creepy. They come out of your mouth. Wait till you see episode 2. So they have to bite you to spread the fungus. It doesn't spread through the air like actual fungus. We'll talk about that in a second. But episode 2 uses the tendrils in other ways, which we will discuss then. But as someone who has dealt with mold, I can tell you that mold without spores is totally inaccurate. And watching the show, I was like, where are the spores? So it was interesting to see that the game did have them. I was like, you can't get that close to mold. What are you guys doing? And I can understand the show was like, we don't want our actors to have to keep putting on gas masks, covering their faces. And they want their characters to be able to get right up in it. But it's totally unrealistic for you to be able to get that close to this stuff. It just was weird. Like, they find that body in the basement and they're like, ooh, weird, yucky. And I'm like, you are so close to that. How are you not infected? And then they were burning the bodies, but they were still picking them up. I was like, at least use a fork, man. They were picking them up with not even in hazmat suits. So it makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense. It kept kind of like keeping me from totally believing it. With any kind of infection, especially environmental, you need to keep your distance as infections spread. And they use the air to spread. Plants use the air to spread. What do you think pollen is, right? I guess the humans are kind of like bees. That's funny. But they still use the air too. So there's the air. And so now in this case, the fungus can only spread through bites. So it makes them seem more like traditional zombies, which also can only spread their virus through bites. But I think that robs The Last of Us of a truly unique aspect that the game has, where this is airborne. And then also of how horrifying this would be in real life, and that it could be in the air. Also, if there are no spores, how did Joel and Sarah's neighbor get infected? I didn't see, anyone bite her. And wouldn't that have come up? Like, how did the virus spread so quickly across the globe from Jakarta, like all at once across the entire United States? They were like, it's here. And you're like, I think we would have noticed a bunch of crazy people running around biting everybody and killing some people, right? Like, how did it get into the aircrafts all of a sudden? And how did it not happen in the aircrafts first? Just like the real spread of COVID, it would happen on the airlines first, and then it would happen in the cities, and then in the suburbs. It would spread that way. It didn't make any sense to me. I mean, even though it was a cool moment when all hell broke loose, I really don't think that's how it would go down. Unless maybe it was in the air. If there was a big gust of wind, like when they talk about volcano ash and nuclear fallout because of the wind, then it starts to make sense. But they took that out. So you're like, oh, you can't have your spores, not have your spores and then have them too. By the way, in the game, one of the first signs that you're infected is a hand tremor, which is why that boy's hand was shaking in Sarah's class and they did a close-up on it. But again, if you didn't play the games or know about them, you'd be like, oh, that guy has a nervous tick, whatever. I also feel the show does a poor job establishing the rules that they do have for the fungus, like how quickly you succumb based on where you're bitten. When that little boy is brought in, that was very sad. That woman was describing heaven, where he gets to eat whatever he wants and any toys that he wants. That was really, wow, yikes. But when the little boy comes in, they briefly show a sign that I can't show you here because they didn't publicly release it, but I'll write it out. That if you're bitten in the head, neck, or face, it takes just 5 to 15 minutes for you to turn. If you're bit in the torso, arm, hand, or shoulder, that's 2 to 8 hours. And the leg and the foot is 12 to 24 hours, right? Someone doesn't know Hitchcock's rule of 3. You have to establish and make this clear visually or in terms of dialogue 3 times for the audience to really get it. But because this show has so little interest in establishing the rules of infection, that just underscores that the show's creators prefer to focus on the human drama, which is a bit of a tougher sell. That's what I think separates the Andors from the House of the Dragons and the Stranger Things. I think you have to make it more clear what you're dealing with. We'll see, though. We'll see. And thankfully, the fungus is really bad at coordinating the physicality of its hosts. Because even though they can make humans super strong and fast, they keep falling all over themselves. When that guy was chasing Joel and Sarah right through like the diner or whatever, I was like, the fungus is like, I can't get the hang, give me a moment. Like another fungus is like, you don't know how to drive this thing. And the fungus is like, just give me a minute, I just got it. Because that guy was ridiculous. I was like, he should have caught him several times by now. But while it is less exciting, in terms of like the big show, right? The horrors of humanity are no small thing. And I did find that interesting about this episode. First off, I think part of the appeal of apocalypse stories is that they really level the playing field. And even more so, working class skills actually become the most valuable. It was both fascinating and terrifying to see society vanish in an instant. Everything that we value, everything that we build up, possessions, all that stuff is suddenly meaningless. Just like going forward in the game of life, your accomplishments. To see the board wiped clear like that was shocking and scary, because at least with COVID, you could shelter in place, and because there can be a cure, you just had to ride it out, right? If you wore your mask and you were really careful, you would see the end of this thing, hopefully, knock on wood. But here, there's no home. You immediately have to go on the run because, you could be infected. You're being hunted by the virus and, its agents. And there are also no teams. Like in a scenario like A Quiet Place, at least it's humanity versus the aliens. But here, and I think one thing that does set The Last of Us apart is that it makes it clear that there are no teams. There are no teams. Like even when I was watching Devotion last night, I was like, well, at least, there are two different sides and, you have your fellow soldiers in arms. But here it's like, it's just you. It's just you and everyone is an enemy. You can't even count on the government and the military, although, of course, some people would say that today. There's a funny line about that later in the show. But I think it was when they have that faceless soldier, and that was a great touch, by the way, because, you couldn't see his face and his voice was distorted to, less human. When he guns down Joel and Sarah, killing Sarah, I think that breaks the last bit of hope and faith in Joel. And I don't even think that he realizes that. Come to think of it, he's like a bit of a zombie ant himself. He just goes into survival mode. He just keeps going, right? Putting one foot in front of the other. Not even really processing it, which is why I think his violent, traumatic reaction to another soldier pointing a gun in his face at night in a similar scenario at the end of episode 1 shocks him that he has that reaction because he thought he handled that. But instead he just, buried it deep inside. In fact, I think if Tommy, his brother, wasn't still out there somewhere and Joel felt he needed him, I don't know what Joel would do with himself. And Bill has something very interesting to say on that subject matter in episode 3, which we'll discuss at that point, which really struck me at the time and has stuck with me ever since. I thought it was brilliant, and I can't wait for us to discuss that. It's also interesting to see how quickly humanity devolves here, going back to public executions in the town square, which sets up the fact that how serious it is to leave without permission, and that to some degree, Joel and Tess and Sarah might not be able to ever come back. Joel, Tess, and Ellie. But also, talking about, when he goes to the radio guy saying there are raiders out there, slavers, and you're like, all the bad habits just come rushing back. So, but I guess you can see that on social media that, there's a very thin veil holding people back tragically. Pedro Pascal's Joel really reminds me of Chris Pratt's character in the Jurassic movies, a man's man who is an expert in the land, working with his hands and common sense. It's an American stereotype, an ideal stereotype. And I think it's worth noting that Pascal, a Latino actor, pulls it off just as well as Pratt does. And I think that highlights a truth that even though the demographics of America might change and expand with race and gender, that doesn't mean America itself changes. It's still the same place. It just has a different face. But how true is that even? Because Hollywood, in fact, is responsible for whitewashing history, and that includes cowboys, because it's well documented, in fact, that there have been cowboys of color since there first were cowboys. So I think what Pedro Pascal is doing here is great. I think he's doing a wonderful job, and I also think it's really important. And I think, he does a wonderful job. He's just as good and compelling as Pratt in the Jurassic movies, and they really are the same character. I do think, as someone who didn't play the game, granted, that part of what was so amazing about The Last of Us was that it was a very dramatic, adult, animated movie, filmed with motion capture suits just like James Cameron's Avatar movies. So imagine how weird it would be if Jimmy Cameron said, for the next Avatar movie, I'm going to go back to live action and just put Sam Worthington in special effects makeup. Like, wouldn't that be cool? And you'd be like, no, it would not. I want to see what I like. So I think simply refilming The Last of Us in live action takes away a little bit about what made it unique in the first place, like downgrading the fungus with no spores. I think, maybe they felt that's what they needed to sell it to a wider audience, and going it to HBO in live action does do that. It does allow it to reach a even bigger, games of course are very popular these days, but an even bigger audience, and to become part of the pop culture landscape in a way that it can't just as a game. But maybe, I don't know, maybe they felt in a way to make it more palatable to the general public, they took away a lot of what I think makes the games more special. Is a shame. I think it's weird. And also how, this is a test for how fan bases are going to feel being asked to rewatch a story they already know so well. Is it like a Disney live action remake, right? Or is it like, the idea of redoing Avatar in live action? And you're like, but I already watched it and it was great. At least tell me a new story. You might have noticed from the opening credits that Neil Druckmann, the driving creative force behind the Last of Us video game and the company behind it, Naughty Dog, has an unprecedented level of involvement for someone from the source material in the Hollywood production. And I'm not so sure if that's a good thing, to be honest with you. Every storytelling medium not only takes a different skill set to tell stories in, and some people can do it. Some people can jump from medium to medium, but it's hard. And then also you have to consider a different audience. The audience is different. They're in a different space. They're having different conversations. They have different reference points. And I think that Craig Mazin from Chernobyl was supposed to balance Druckmann out. But I don't know if Mazin is a strong enough visionary himself to take the lead and to do what needs to be done to make The Last of Us not only a show, but a compelling show that can compete in a space where they've already done apocalyptic and zombie storylines. I think Mazin might be too reverential to Druckmann, quite frankly. I would have been like, thanks, Neil. I'm going to put your name in the credits, but we're going to take it from here. If you want to tell another Last of Us story, go make another game. I am curious what your reaction is to seeing the live action version of the story so far. Because, you did see like almost an hour and a half of it. All right, now let's talk Easter eggs, so to speak. And that's another thing. This show is, Easter egg and breakdown light. Because, the video game is pretty simplistic. There's not like a big mythology to draw from. Sarah, here she's played by Nico Parker, daughter of Thandaway Newton, right? They look alike. And like her, by the way, Thandaway Newton is the star and has come into her own actually on another HBO show, Westworld, where her Maeve is my favorite character there, actually. But like her mother, Nico Parker is not only a very capable action heroine, but a very likable one. And she's wearing the same shirt, by the way, from the game for a fictional band called Halcyon Drops. At first I thought that might be Carly Simon, but it's a group called Halcyon Drops. And in fact, their tour stops, before the apocalypse actually coincide with the locations Joel and Ellie visit on their journey in this first season. And Nico Parker had to sell a lot of ridiculous moments here, and she sold them well. And I understand that characters have to do dumb things in order to have a horror movie in the first place, right? Even Joel has to make mistakes now and then. I couldn't believe he forgot to bring home the cake. As soon as he walked in the door, I was like, where's the cake, man? Are we having a birthday party or not? But like when the news was like, stay inside. And then Sarah immediately went outside to deal with the dog. I actually shouted at my TV, didn't you hear? Stay inside. I felt very bad for her. Nico Parker was a great guest star. She really made a strong impression. Fast forward, and she needed to because that's such a defining situation for Joel. Fast forward to 2023, the head of the Fireflies is actually played by the same actress who did the motion capture for that character in the game. Although the character in the game does not look like her. And I have to say the real actress does not have the right look for the leader of the Fireflies, to be honest with you. It was too much of a glam look. I didn't like it. I'm not surprised that the Fireflies don't get anything done, by the way. Remember she's like, we're a horrible revolutionary group. We've accomplished nothing. And I was like, you seem more like the PTA, I'll be honest with you. I do not have a lot of faith in this revolutionary group. Even if she's wearing the same outfit, I don't care. She didn't sell it. And so, people who watch the game might just be caught up in the fact and be like, oh, it's the same actress from the game. She has the same outfit on. Woohoo. But I as someone who doesn't watch the game, I'm like, I don't buy you as a group of revolutionaries. Certainly not one to root for because you do seem inept. A couple of other actors from the game, by the way, are going to show up during these episodes, but only Merle Dandridge is playing the character she originated. Everybody else is playing another character. And so I will point them out to you when they show up. And by the way, the ones that I've seen all do a wonderful job, so good for them. I think that is nice. I've seen it, especially as more and more stuff and animation and video games gets adapted into live action. I do see the talent, the actors who are quite capable, who originated these characters, kind of being annoyed that they don't go along for the ride. Speaking of the games, Riley is mentioned very quickly, just once, when the leader of the Fireflies says to Ellie, was Riley a terrorist? And anybody who's played the game, their ears are going to perk up because that is actually a character from a DLC, which is an add-on. It's like a bonus round, basically, if you're not familiar with game lingo. I'm just learning myself. But that was a prequel that showed how Ellie first got infected in order to discover that she's immune. And it was actually Riley, who was the one who, at the Federal Military School for Orphans, wanted to run away and join the Fireflies. Riley is also an early, if not the first romantic spark for Ellie, who in the Last of Us sequel goes on to have a serious girlfriend who's a very big part of that story. Riley is also where Ellie gets a book of puns that are going to show up later. And I know some people are like, oh, I like knowing, some people who played the games are like, oh, that's a cool Easter egg. That this is the level of Easter eggs we have here. But I think that it would have maybe helped to incorporate the DLC a little bit more at the beginning of this show, just to give a better establish Ellie and ground her a little bit better. And I think to make those moments pop a little bit more, because again, game players will be like, oh, and people who are just watching for the first time, which I think is going to be a large chunk of this audience, are going to be like, I didn't even notice that. Speaking of romantic partners, I really like Tess. Not only because I like the actress, but she's like the female version of Joel. And I think that Anna Torv does a really good job of being the female version of Joel. I believe it. And we'll discuss her character as the story progresses. Finally, some of my favorite lines. I'm not a fan of religious fanatics for obvious reasons, but the line from the neighbor saying 3 nails plus 1 cross equals 4 given, I was like, I will give it to you. That's pretty catchy. I've never heard that before. Is that like a saying? But I thought that was, I was like, that's pretty good. Then a facility making pills and bullets is an awesome idea. And basically The Last of Us in a nutshell. Violence and the emotional fallout of that violence. Although a weird pitch for a show. What's it about? It's about a zombie apocalypse and how it makes you feel. And you're like, what is this Pixar? Is this Pixar in video game clothing? So anyway, and then I liked when Tess tells Joel about the guys who roughed her up. She says, I promised you wouldn't hurt him, but I would very much like for you to hurt him. I was like, that's a Scorsese level line. I love it. So I think the show is very, very solid. And as a genre fan, I'm interested. My interest is piqued. But so far, it's not a wow. I don't think it's a wow. And I do wonder if it will maintain its audience or shed its audience. I think some people might be like with Andor, be like, I'm going to take a break and come back to binge. I'm very curious to see how people watch the show, especially because, again, at least so far, it's not a particularly spoilery show, so you don't have to watch it when it drops like House of the Dragon so that you can be part of the conversation. Let's see if there's a big Sunday night conversation. That's important. That's crucial too. And we're only on episode 1. But I am curious to hear your initial thoughts and whether or not you play the games. Share those thoughts down below. Be sure to join me here every week to discuss this show. Subscribe today so you don't miss any of those videos. And of course, as always, you can check out some other videos that are ready right now. Right now!